It's Saturday morning, and you're standing at the counter in a coat you bought 11 years ago, still holding up, still fitting the same way it did the day you got it. Through the window, your neighbor is backing a brand new SUV out of the driveway, the temporary plate still taped in the window. He waves, you wave back. Your car is parked where it always is, unremarkable, paid for, doing exactly what a car is supposed to do. You're not thinking about either vehicle. You're thinking about what you're making for breakfast. Nobody watching you this morning would know anything about what's actually in your accounts. That's not modesty. That's not an accident. That's a decision you made a long time ago. One you didn't even realize you were making until it had already changed you. This is the story of how you stopped thinking like someone trying to become rich and started thinking like money that had already been in the family for 100 years. Nobody handed you an inheritance. Nobody handed you a name that opened doors. What changed was quieter than that, and it started with a sentence you weren't even supposed to be listening to. Rewind to the version of you in your mid-20s. You had a job, a decent one, and every extra dollar that came through your hands left just as fast, dressed up as something else. A better phone before the old one broke. A jacket because someone at work mentioned a brand once. A car that cost more than it needed to, because the car you actually needed didn't say anything about you, and you wanted it to say something. You weren't reckless. You weren't out of control. You were doing what almost everyone around you was doing, which is exactly why it never felt like a problem. Your friend group ran on a kind of quiet competition nobody admitted to running. Somebody got new furniture. Somebody upgraded their phone plan to the unlimited everything tier they didn't need. Somebody's watch showed up in every photo for a month. You told yourself you were just enjoying your 20s. And you were. You just hadn't noticed yet that enjoying your 20s and financing your 20s had become the same sentence. Your friend Jordan lived loudest of anyone you knew. New lease every couple of years, a credit card that traveled well, a habit of mentioning prices in a way that wasn't quite bragging, but wasn't quite not bragging either. You didn't judge him for it. You were doing the same thing at a smaller scale. Different numbers, same instinct. There was a rhythm to it that felt almost automatic. Payday arrived, and within days, most of it had already been assigned somewhere, not to anything urgent, just to whatever felt like it mattered that week. You told yourself you'd start saving seriously once you made more. It's a sentence that feels true right up until you realize everyone making more says the exact same thing about the amount after that. At a family gathering that fall, an old friend of your father's showed up the way he always did, in a truck that had clearly been driven hard for a long time and never once apologized for it. His name was Frank. He'd built and sold 2 businesses in his life, and as far as anyone could tell from looking at him, owned exactly nothing. Same house for 30 years. Same coat every winter. Somebody, half joking, asked him why a man who'd made real money still drove that truck. Frank thought about it for a second longer than the question really needed, and said, "Money that needs to be seen isn't done working yet. Mine stopped needing an audience a long time ago." Nobody quite knew what to do with that. The conversation moved on within a minute. But you sat with it longer than a minute. You sat with it, honestly, for the rest of the night. There was something in the way he said it, not preachy, not superior, just settled, like a man who'd already had the argument with himself years earlier and won it. That night, you actually opened your accounts and looked, really looked, instead of glancing. It wasn't a disaster. It also wasn't anything. Some savings that barely counted as savings, a small revolving balance you'd stop noticing the way you stopped noticing a hum in the background of a room, and nothing that could honestly be called an investment. You closed the app. You didn't do anything about it that night, but you didn't forget the sentence either. For a few weeks, it just sat there, uninvited, showing up while you were doing unrelated things, standing in line for coffee, scrolling past something you almost bought. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was closer to being seen by someone who wasn't even trying to see you. Here's the part that doesn't make for a good highlight reel, because nothing about it looked dramatic from the outside. You didn't have a windfall. You didn't get a raise that changed everything. You just started asking a different question before you spent money. Not, can I afford this? Which you could almost always technically answer yes to, but does this need to exist in 10 years, or does it just need to exist this weekend? Old money, you started to understand, doesn't buy the newest version of something. It buys the version built to be the last one it ever needs. A coat meant to outlast a decade instead of a season. A car meant to be driven into the ground instead of traded in before the new car smell fades. Not because it's cheaper in the moment, sometimes it isn't, but because it removes the need to think about it again. That's the actual luxury, not the object. The silence afterward. You canceled the subscription you weren't using. You renegotiated the payment you'd been letting run on autopilot without asking why it was that high. You set up a transfer that left your checking account the same day your paycheck landed, before you had the chance to decide you needed something. It was small. It felt almost embarrassingly small. And for a long time, nothing about your life looked any different at all, which turned out to be exactly the point. Jordan, meanwhile, moved into a bigger apartment with a better view and told everyone about the view. You noticed. You didn't say anything. Around this time, you also started paying attention to the difference between things that held their worth and things that quietly bled it out the moment you owned them. A well-made pair of boots resoled instead of replaced. Furniture bought once, not upgraded every time a trend shifted. None of it looked like a financial decision from the outside. It just looked like taste. That was the trick of it. Old money doesn't announce its restraint. It just lives inside it so completely that restraint stops looking like restraint at all. This stretch of your life doesn't have a scene worth retelling at a party. And that's the honest truth about most of what actually works. There was no clever trade, no tip from a friend, no single decision that changed everything overnight. There was just the same unremarkable transfer, the same quiet decision, not to upgrade something that still worked, repeated for years, long enough that it stopped feeling like discipline and started feeling like who you were. You started noticing things about Frank you hadn't paid attention to before. He never talked about money directly. He talked about how he'd run his businesses, how he never bought equipment. He couldn't pay off quickly, how the people who looked the most successful on any given day were almost never the ones still standing 5 years later. He wasn't teaching you anything on purpose. He just talked, and you'd learned, somewhere along the way, to actually listen. He also talked sometimes about his own father, a man he described as impossible to read financially, who wore the same 3 shirts in rotation, and once fixed a roof himself rather than pay someone else to. Not out of necessity, but out of a kind of stubborn belief that convenience was a habit worth resisting. Frank said it took him decades to understand that his father wasn't cheap. He was simply refusing to let money make decisions for him in either direction, refusing to spend it carelessly and refusing to worship it either. Your account balance, which used to feel like a source of anxiety, slowly turned into something closer to background noise. Not because you stopped caring, but because the number stopped being urgent. It was simply growing, in the unglamorous way water fills a tank you can't see into, and you checked it the way you check the weather, out of habit more than worry. Somewhere in this stretch, you got a modest raise, the kind that would once have gone straight into a bigger apartment or a nicer lease. Instead, you increased the transfer and left everything else exactly the way it was. Nobody around you would have guessed anything had changed. That was becoming the whole pattern of your life. The visible parts stayed still while the invisible parts kept moving. There was a stretch, a few years in, when the market dropped hard and fast, and the number on your screen shrank in a way that made your stomach turn the first time you saw it. You called Frank, not really asking for advice, just needing to hear from someone who wasn't panicking. He said something you didn't fully appreciate until much later. You haven't lost anything you haven't sold. The account is smaller today. It won't be smaller forever, and even if it is, forever is a long way from today. You kept your transfer running through the whole thing. It felt wrong in the moment, buying in while everything was falling. The way it always feels wrong, right up until it doesn't. Months later, the account wasn't just back where it had been. It was further ahead than it had ever been before the drop. What stayed with you longer than the recovery itself was how little Frank's own life seemed to change during any of it. He didn't check anything more often. He didn't mention it again unless you brought it up. It wasn't indifference, it was distance, the kind that only comes from having lived through the same cycle enough times to stop mistaking a bad quarter for a verdict on your entire future. Somewhere around your early 30s, something shifted that had nothing to do with a raise. You looked at your account one quiet weekend and realized the growth from the market that quarter had outpaced everything you'd personally contributed. Not by a little. By enough that you checked the math twice because it didn't feel like it should be true yet. For years, your effort had been the entire engine. Now the engine had started running partly on its own, quietly, in the background, whether you paid attention to it or not. Nobody throws a parade for that moment. There's no ceremony. You just wake up one ordinary Tuesday and realize the thing you built has started building itself. That same year, an appliance in your home failed at the worst possible time, the kind of repair that would have wrecked your month a few years earlier. You paid it without a second thought, without checking a backup account, without doing the math in your head first. It wasn't a triumphant moment. It barely registered. And that, it turns out, is what actual security feels like. Not a celebration, an absence of panic. Around the same time, your company offered you a promotion with a meaningfully bigger title and a schedule that would have swallowed most of your evenings. 3 years earlier, you would have taken it without a second thought, because more money had always felt like the only correct answer to any offer. This time you turned it down, and it was the first purely financial decision of your adult life that wasn't really about money at all. The extra income would have bought you almost nothing your current life didn't already provide. It would have cost you the one thing your money had never been able to buy back. Getting quiet with money changes more than your bank balance. It changes your relationship to almost everyone around you, and not always in a direction you expected. Your partner, Maya, asked you one evening why you still drove the same car everyone else had upgraded twice by now. You didn't have a clean answer for her at first. Later, you told her the truth. You could afford almost anything you wanted, and that was exactly why you'd stopped needing to prove it with a car. Jordan's lease got repossessed the following year. His income hadn't dropped. He'd simply kept adding obligations against it, the way people do when the visible version of success is the only version anyone's actually tracking. You helped him quietly, the same way your own accounts had grown quietly, and neither of you ever brought it up again. You noticed you'd stopped bringing up money in conversation entirely, not to hide it, but because there was no version of that conversation that didn't land strangely in one direction or another. When old friends stressed over a bill that used to stress you out too, you understood the feeling was real for them. You just couldn't fully access it anymore, and pretending you could felt more dishonest than saying nothing. Being underestimated used to feel like an edge. At some point, it started feeling a little lonely too, being financially unreadable to people who'd known you your whole life. Frank never mentioned that part at the dinner table. Maybe there wasn't a clean way to say it. Maybe you had to find it yourself before it would have meant anything. There's a particular kind of silence that comes with this version of a life well built. You stopped performing, and performing was, for a long time, the way you connected with people, even if you never would have called it that at the time. Losing the performance means losing a certain kind of easy conversation. What replaces it is quieter, harder to explain at a party, and, you eventually decide, worth it anyway. Frank passed away a couple of winters ago. At the small gathering after, his daughter mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd left behind far more than anyone in the family had ever guessed, sitting quietly in accounts nobody had thought to ask about, still driving that same beaten-up truck right up until the end. You didn't say much that day. You just thought about a sentence from a dinner table years earlier, and about a coat you'd worn for over a decade, and about how the whole story of getting here was never really about the number at all. It was about who needed to know it and who never needed to. Which brings you back to this Saturday morning. The coat, the window, the neighbor with the new SUV he'll trade in again in 3 years. You finish your coffee. You drive the same reliable car. Nobody watching you would know anything, and for the first time in your life, that's exactly how you want it. You didn't say much that day. You just thought about a sentence from a dinner table years earlier, and about a coat you'd worn for over a decade, and about how the whole story of getting here was never really about the number at all. It was about who needed to know it, and who never needed to.